In this presentation, we will look at what the inspector reports. In the all-crew briefing, we heard a little about what the inspector reports. In particular, we heard how the inspector will report great performance in a team as well as things that need to improve. You'll remember that we also talked about not recording the names of people involved and not blaming people when they could not execute a task well. Let's look at what the inspector reports and why it's so important to avoid blame. First, let's look in more detail at what the difference is between the different observations. If an inspector makes an exceeds expectation observation, they have probably seen a situation where there are healthy performance-influencing factors, or PIFs, that would make the task very reliable. As expected observations are most common and suggest a task was executed okay on the day, and there didn't seem to be any healthy or unhealthy PIFs to affect the task reliability. A largely as expected suggests the inspector has seen unhealthy PIFs that could potentially impact the reliability of the task but probably didn't affect the critical aspect. For example, there may be a procedure that's a bit unhelpful and bulky, but when it comes to the critical step, it's very clear. This type of response tells you there are opportunities to improve something that could cause problems in the future. Finally, if the execution of a task is not as expected, the inspector has seen issues or PIFs that make mistakes more likely or don't support the task. Then we have an opportunity to make the PIFs healthy, making the task more likely to be successful. Here's an example of what the inspector has seen and reported. The SIRE 2.0 question is, were the master and navigating officers familiar with the company procedures for the setup and operation of the ECDIS units, and were records available to show ECDIS has been operated in accordance with them? What the inspector observes is that the navigator understands the ECDIS system well, but there is a gap. The vessel doesn't routinely verify the satellite positioning, and that's a problem, because GPS signal can wander and then a vessel might find itself in the wrong position compared to hazards. When the inspector consults the company management system, they see there are options for verifying position, but they aren't very clear about the preferred method or frequency. From the discussion, the inspector notes two unhealthy PIFs. The criticality of this task hasn't been recognized and the procedures aren't helpful. The inspector records this as not as expected. To tackle this observation, we would need to address the unhealthy PIFs by recognizing that this is a critical task that requires better guidance on the frequency and type of method that a vessel would need to be doing to verify GPS positioning. Here's another example covering under-keel calculations. The SIRE 2.0 question is, does the operator provide guidance on minimum UKC and squat? Here's an interesting case. There was actually a mistake in the under-keel clearance calculation, but the inspector ranked it as expected. How is that? We've accepted that people make mistakes, that's just a part of life. There was an independent check of the UKC, a second calculation, that detected the error. The inspector felt that the criticality of the UKC was recognized, particularly the critical step of checking the calculation result, and this is supported by the master saying that there is a routine cross-check. But it doesn't stop there. Realizing that the vessel can't meet the minimum under-keel clearance, the vessel immediately informed the company and the port authority. They conducted a risk assessment, and with information from the port authority, the vessel could adjust its speed to make safe passage through the river section. The inspector felt that this chain of events was a healthy indication of good team dynamics, communication, and coordination. The inspector records this as expected. There is no strict rule for how many performance-influencing factors, or PIFs, would trigger a not as expected, or how well the task has to be executed to warrant an exceeds, but there are some things you can bear in mind. The inspector knows that the person they are observing is just the tip of the iceberg of the conditions that will ensure a task gets done reliably. They are looking for evidence that these conditions are there to help people be successful in the task. As expected is the most likely response for most tasks. As long as the task does what it's intended to do, it might warrant an as expected. The task may have been demonstrated or explained by someone, and it meets the intent of the requirements even if there is the odd bit or detail missing here or there. In our galley example, the task to check and change the ventilation filters was being done, even if not everybody knew what was required. In the same example, the galley assistant was able to show how to extinguish a pan fire with a blanket, even though there was a reminder from the inspector to keep the face clear. On both occasions, that task was being done and there were no particular issues. Of course, everybody wants to exceed. Exceeding means that the task is being done, and there's also evidence of systematic reasons why it is very effective and reliable. Perhaps the galley crew exceed expectations. Maybe they tell the inspector that anybody can use any extinguisher method, and they have a monthly stand-down to practice a variety of techniques. They talk about a weekly sweep of the kitchen, checking that fire doors aren't lashed in the open position or fire extinguishers aren't blocked with cleaning gear. Or maybe they describe a condition they weren't happy with, which was acted on by the company. There is evidence of systematic reasons for the tasks and the kitchen being in the excellent condition it's in. If a task is not as expected, it primarily means that the task isn't working, or there is something which makes the task unreliable. In our satellite positioning system example, we saw that the officer was very well versed in the ECDIS operation, but the verification of the satellite positioning wasn't being done. This was not necessarily an issue with the officer. They are under the impression that verification is only needed when there's a problem, but there is some uncertainty in the guidance from the company. With a largely as expected assessment, the task is probably executed okay, but there are some PIFs that could cause problems in the future. Let's say that the officer does do verification, but the frequency is inconsistent, and the procedure is unhelpful about method and frequency. An inspector might decide that the task is carried out acceptably, but with a different officer or different circumstances in the future, maybe it would fall through the gaps.